From Studio C in the 511 Studios in the Brewery District, located in downtown Columbus, Ohio, this is Note to Future Me. I'm Brett Johnson, owner of Circle 270 Media Podcast Consultants. Note to Future Me is dedicated to interviewing businesses and organizations who have implemented podcasting into their marketing strategy. In this episode, I talk with Stephanie Evans and Michelle Wilson. Michelle was the first and former host of TriVillage Chamber Partnership's Business Inspires podcast in her role as the executive director. With Michelle leaving that position, Stephanie is now the executive director and the new host. At the time of this recording, Stephanie was just beginning the transition and had recorded a few episodes on her own. Now, podcast hosts are going to change over time. How should your company prepare for it? Well, the key word there is prepare and keep the podcast's mission at the forefront. Michelle and Stephanie are going to cover that in great detail in this episode. Full disclosure, though, Business Inspires is a client of Circle 270 Media Podcast Consultants, and the focus of this podcast is all about the Chamber and their podcast. If your business is using podcasting as a marketing or branding tool, I would love to showcase your podcast. Go to notetofutureme.com and scroll down to my booking calendar. You can find all this information in the show notes as well. I'm going to have the full transcript of the podcast on my podcast website, notetofutureme.com, and circle270media.com. And as always, thanks for taking notes with me. Well, before we get into the heavy of the podcast, talking about Business Inspires podcast, I want to ask each of you, Michelle and Stephanie, about nonprofits that you support, that you give time, talent, or treasure to. And I'll start with Michelle.
Sure. I think that the one nearest and dearest to my heart right now is the new Nationwide Children's Hospital on Our Sleeves. It's a mental health awareness program, and I think that, it's something that's so important and needed, and the conversation, while it seems like it's out there a lot, I think it's really just beginning. And so I think it's an amazing program, and I definitely I'm trying to become more involved with it. I've supported it financially, and just figuring out ways that I can support it otherwise.
And Stephanie?
I would say the one that I probably spend most of my time with is Best Buddies, Best Buddies Ohio. It's part of a national organization to assist folks with developmental disabilities, to engage them in one-on-one friendships, and then to help find them work in the workplace. So my husband's on the board there for Best Buddies Ohio, and I help out when I can, and really my whole family's involved because there are high school and college age groups as well to help the students make lifelong friendships. So it's a really great organization. That's where we spend our time.
Great, thanks. So let's talk a little bit about each of your professional backgrounds, and as the podcast develops, we'll kind of figure out, and the listener will figure out, this is where the two come together and why this is a podcast about the TriVillage Chamber Partnership's Business Inspires podcast. So let's start with Michelle, because your history with the TriVillage Chamber Partnership is longer. And,
Yes.
and let's talk a little bit about your background and how you became a part of the TVCP.
Okay. Well, I have always been in the nonprofit or not-for-profit world. I started out at Experience Columbus when it was the Greater Columbus Convention and Visitors Bureau way back when, and moved around a little bit from there in membership departments at the Columbus Zoo and Aquarium and the Ohio Hotel and Lodging Association. So always found that was kind of where I landed, and was able to land an amazing position with the Grandview Area Chamber back in 2009 when they were looking for their first full-time director. So I landed there, got that job. Grandview was where I grew up and had my kids, and so it was a nice fit. I knew the community. I knew a lot of people there, and we were able to then grow and expand that into a merger between the Upper Arlington Chamber and the Grandview and Marble Cliff Chambers. So we, in 2016, became the TriVillage Chamber Partnership. So that's my background. And, of course, I have recently left that position after almost 10 years and landed back at Experience Columbus. So a little bit of a full circle there.
Exactly. Stephanie.
So for me, I started at the National Kidney Foundation of Ohio in the communications department there, and then kind of moved my way up ultimately to executive director position there, and was there for a while, and then left that position really to stay home, to start a family, and then in that time started what turned out to be 3 businesses of my own. So small business owner. So
one just wasn't enough. I got to do 3.
They weren't all simultaneous. They were kind of, a couple of them
Not one,
overlapped.
not 2, but 3.
Yeah, a couple of them overlapped. And anyway, so spent that time having my own business and raising my kids at home. And then a couple of years ago, just had some changes take place in my personal life and decided to let my photography business go. That's what my more recent one was. And really through a friend of mine who happened to be related to Michelle, let me know that there was an opening there, and I connected with Michelle, and that's how I landed at the chamber. Came in as the membership manager part-time, and have been there almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years in March. And then when Michelle made her next step, I switched seats, and I went from membership manager to executive director.
From the baby pool to the deep end.
That's right.
Quite literally. Yeah.
I have you both on because we were talking about this before recording. I've jumped on this theme by accident of host transitions. And the Business Inspires podcast is now going through a host transition. Michelle had hosted the podcast from its inception up through her leaving recently, and Stephanie's now taking the realm and doing the interviews and setting up scheduling for guests and such for Business Inspires. So I wanted to bring both of you together to talk about that. Now, Michelle will have a little bit more knowledge on the beginnings, as I will too, but I think it's worth the discussion because this is a chamber-focused podcast, Business Inspires. So why a podcast for TriVillage Chamber Partnership? Michelle?
Well, for me, it was having discussions with you, and I hadn't even really considered it, but when you approached me, it seemed like kind of an edgy, new, different thing to do. And I think that's one of the things I liked to pride myself or the chamber on at the time. We were going through a merger that was something that was pretty rare. And we had taken a couple of leaps of faith along the way with the Grandview Area Chamber and done some really cool projects that that others had not yet tried. And so I thought this was a really great new edgy way to perhaps reach a new demographic. Chambers and membership organizations in general were going through a bit of an identity crisis, and I thought this might be a really cool way to reach the younger demographic that didn't necessarily understand why they should be a member of a chamber of commerce.
Mm-hmm. And I know when we first started too, I was looking at it as a potential engagement tool. Mm-hmm. But I know chambers have a difficulty. Yeah, they have the email database is great, but the open rate, no. And right. The feedback from members and getting them involved in such. And I was envisioning the podcast as possibly as an engagement tool as well, too.
Right.
That, if nothing else, reaching out to members, being a part of the podcast, and getting them involved in a different way that they hadn't even thought about. It's like, oh, wow.
Right.
And
they didn't understand it.
They didn't.
Any more than I did.
Correct, yes. And I'm trying to go in back my mind how the process began. I think we just had coffee to talk about this idea. And luckily you were very welcoming to the idea too, because I think I laid it out as you have a lot of content, great content. Mm-hmm. And you refined it even more talking about, okay, let's talk to businesses about how they started and how they're growing.
Right.
And I kind of want to go a little bit more on that.
Right. Why
that popped in your mind.
Well, I think we're really lucky in the TriVillage area that we we just had we have a really great group of members. And one of the things that we never really have to preach is to support one another and, make sure you're using member businesses and make sure you're looking there first. People just naturally do it. And so you may use a vendor here and there that you've gotten great service from, but you don't really know why they do what they do or why they got started. So I thought it would be kind of a neat premise to figure out, if this was something they really was their lifelong aspiration or if they just kind of landed there. So I think finding their personal connection to what they do was just a different way to approach it. There are lots of business podcasts out there. And I thought maybe putting a spin on it might be more engaging.
And I think the guests have done a great job as well, and they get it when they're on the podcast.
Yes.
They bring it back into why the chamber is so important to them.
Right. Sure.
Not a guest that we've talked to that we've had to tell them, hey, be sure to incorporate why the chamber is so important to you.
We've never asked that question.
Never have asked that. It's come up organically in every interview. And Stephanie, even the couple of we've done have come up with your transition. We've never told them to say anything about it.
Right. It did just come up naturally.
It's amazing. And again, you can have the leading questions. We had one, not leading questions, but to incorporate that maybe one member has done a lot to help with some events and such. Well, that's going to come up in conversation, obviously, too.
Right.
And I know we talked initially, too, Michelle, when I brought up the idea, I knew that I had to come up with a way that might be comfortable for you. And I knew the question may come up about, what kind of podcast? Are you talking about me just being the podcast?
Right.
And that's why I introduced, let's do the interview. It makes it a whole lot easier.
Yeah.
But you still had the nervousness in regards to, I'm not an interviewer. I haven't done radio, quote unquote. How do I do this? How did you prepare yourself to be, I think, a great interviewer? And I think you agree now too. I think you've done a great job with it. You actually started to have a lot of fun after the first couple. You did.
Right.
How did you jump into that in regards to getting yourself prepared and getting more comfortable to being an interviewer?
Well, I think, again, going back to just who we are who our personality is at the chamber is we're very relationship driven. And, while everybody says that, I believe it to be true. I believe that, so much of the success of the TriVillage Chamber has been because Stephanie and I have gotten to know people, and we know them on a personal level generally, and we do, not every single person, but I think that's been a big part of the success. And so preparing was for the podcast was just figuring out how do I ask somewhat personal questions without getting too personal, and finding out what it is they wanted to be when they were young, and having them take a step back and look at why they are where they are. So, I did basically the same research every single time. And we did identify, at least initially, we identified members that perhaps I knew a little more on a personal level so that I could, they were kind of my guinea pigs. And, I could ask them questions that, and I would be more comfortable asking them questions because I kind of knew what their answers would be. Although I think each time they surprised me. And that was also kind of fun. So it was always a discovery, no matter how much I thought I knew going into the interview. And I think that led each time to a really great end product.
It did. I agree. And I was thinking about the time process when our first discussion and when we kind of kicked it off. I don't remember actually how many weeks, months it took. I think it went fairly quickly, honestly.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the time that it took, and this is part of the interview process, is booking people, getting those businesses in. Because at that time, we were very lucky to have a great relationship with a local radio station group to utilize their studios. I know the owner was extremely happy to have business owners coming in to the radio station just to see the Hollywood of it. To be a part of this podcast, but also, just a monthly process of seeing new businesses coming in because of this podcast. So that was a nice relationship at that point in time to get things going, to legitimize the podcast as well.
Right.
Working with the radio station group and the sound. of the podcast versus just being in front of a computer, laptop, and, okay, talk as close as you can to the screen. You know.
It made a difference. It definitely, it made a difference being in a professional setting.
And I think it made it a little bit easier for you, too, I'm assuming, because you were at a radio station. This is what happens here.
Right.
Interviews.
Right.
And content.
Right.
That sort of thing, yeah.
And I was lucky enough to be a part of a couple of other podcasts, and they were fine. You know, I would never say anything negative about them other than the sound quality, the difference in sound quality. I felt, really lucky that we had what we had with that radio station.
Yes. And I think the process of us moving as fast as we did, I'm going to say probably a couple of months, quite frankly. I didn't mark
think it
time.
was,
It probably was. That we didn't really have a lot of people involved.
Right, that's true.
We went rogue for the most part.
If you ask my past board members, they would say that, Michelle asks forgiveness, not permission. And that's just how it worked.
And I don't know if that's the proper way for any chamber to think about doing something like this.
Right.
But what is the harm? As long as you have the game plan, and this is the direction you're going with it. And you focused a couple of the board members as guests as well, so that made a big difference.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, some of that was strategic, but, they also were really good interviews. I mean, perhaps it was, for a double reason, but there was good content there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How has the podcast been able to showcase the chamber's expertise? How did you incorporate that, as well as, with Stephanie coming in as well, too, what the chamber is? And I know there's, like you said, an atmosphere, a culture that the TriVillage Chamber Partnership has compared to any other chamber, good, bad, whatever. Every chamber has its culture, its feel. How do you think you incorporated that in regards to what you were doing with the podcast, as well as what Stephanie will be doing in the future, too?
Steph, do you want to take that? I can take that. I think I can take that. So there's a saying, and I probably said this on past podcasts, that, you've seen one chamber, you've seen one chamber. We all operate very differently. Every community is so different, and, partnerships vary. And, the Grandview area, Upper Arlington area, and now, of course, TriVillage, I think, have been very lucky to have good relationships with their city governments, with their key players in the area. And I think that really played beautifully into the podcast just being an extension of what it was we were already doing. And that was, finding new ways to engage our members, finding new ways to keep them interested and on board. And when we started receiving feedback pretty quickly. I mean, it takes a while to build your listenership, of course. But when we started receiving feedback pretty quickly from members who were intrigued by the fact that we were doing a podcast, and they were learning about these small businesses on a different level, that was exciting. And I think going back to some other chances we took as a chamber, the Chamber Challenge, when we did a business makeover in 3 days, and that was a huge undertaking and a great success story. So the podcast was just kind of the next thing we were trying. And I joked about asking forgiveness, not permission, but kind of true. I mean, we just kind of said, sure, that sounds like a good idea. Let's give it a shot. And we didn't have a lot to lose, and it's turned out to be a really great benefit, I think, to our members. And people are asking to be a part of it now. And so I think it was just natural that it was something we did that was different and edgy.
I think one great story that came out of, I think we maybe had 3 or 4 published at the time, that the first episode that we published, she got an inquiry about her business for a new business.
And got the business.
Business. When you told me that, I'm going, wow, okay, this stuff kind of works, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, we thought, gosh, if that happens every single time, we've got something.
Right.
Which, of course, jokingly, we knew that wasn't going to happen every single time. But
being the first episode
but
of
the very
the
first
whole
episode did
podcast.
Produce business. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. And that was a difficult episode because that was your first, that was her first. but it came out great.
We were
she
both
got
so nervous.
And she got to showcase exactly what she wanted to for her business, that it obviously worked.
Yeah, she came out beautifully. She really did a great job.
She did. Have you seen adding the podcast content to the website improve the site's search component?
That's a great question that I would have to. I don't know that we have done a ton of analytics on it. It's certainly something we can do. I mean, you've provided us with numbers that have increased over time.
Right.
So, I'm certain that it probably has. I wish I could give you exact numbers.
No, that's fine, because I can answer a little bit to that, because I know the user agent piece to the back end that I do see, and this is not atypical of a business-oriented podcast, is a lot more desktop listenership than through phone. So therefore, they are listening via your website or a link through the email.
And one of the things we did on the website too was we added a tab specifically that says podcast, so you don't have to look for the podcast, in the other drop-down menus.
Right.
It used to be part of the news or something like that.
Yes.
So we changed it to add it so you see it right when you log on to the website.
Right.
Which will make a difference over time, of course, too.
Right.
People will see it
much easier to find.
Right. And I know a lot of businesses, they want to add content to their website, but it's like, okay, where do we put it without junking up the site? Or maybe the original design of the site was not really set up to incorporate any video, any audio.
Right.
So it's kind of difficult to measure because it's not in the right place. A tab obviously will help tremendously and such too. And another unexpected thing that happened, though we were focusing on this, we had sponsorship for the podcast.
We did.
We'd always talked about this, but we just, and it come up with a list of potential sponsors, but knowing that any sponsorship could limit who might even want to be on the podcast, or it might sound as though, okay, they're sponsoring, but what are you giving them?
Yeah.
You're a chamber sort of thing. So I think our focus of who did sponsor the podcast made a lot of sense. I'll let you talk about a little bit about the story, because you kind of did. You carried the water on this one.
Yeah. Well, I approached, of course, the TriVillage Chamber partnership is made up of Grandview Heights, Marble Cliff, and Upper Arlington. And so, we approached the three of them and said, these are the businesses that are representative of each of your areas. So let's get you on board. And what I really love is that the smallest of those three municipalities stepped up, and the Village of Marble Cliff got it really quickly. And, they went through a few readings, and they listened to some podcasts, and they stepped up with some dollars. And, one of the things we said was, we'll be sure to make sure that we are including businesses in the Village of Marble Cliff. There aren't a ton. It's a very small village. So, not a huge ask on their part, but some great businesses there. And the businesses that we had already had focused on in Marble Cliff helped sell it. And then, we made a commitment to feature some more. And we did that, and we're still doing that. So, I was really happy that they stepped up, not just from a dollar perspective, but because it was a great way for a small village to get some awesome exposure. And, their logo went on there, and then they got to think of a fun slogan and tagline. And so, I think it helped them and is helping them in a different way as well.
There's a little bit of moral support, too. I felt really good after you. I know you called me. It wasn't an email. Hey, we got a sponsor, and said who it was. And it was a struggle. It was, and it will be working with municipalities and cities. Of course, the process is a bit slower. A lot more people have to sign off on these ideas of money being spent.
Right.
Totally understand that versus going to a business as a sponsorship.
Yeah. So
hearing that feedback and knowing that they're going to do that meant monumental pushing a big rock.
Right.
That knowing that it doesn't matter what size of government there is, there had to be a lot of eyeballs seeing this. Yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this because this money is being spent here versus here. So it was good feedback.
One of the things that their mayor, Kent, had said about it was that they view it as a professional education opportunity for the businesses in the Marble Cliff area, and felt like that by supporting the podcast, it was encouraging their businesses to listen in, because they can't always make it to a luncheon or a breakfast or a coffee or an event where we might have a speaker or some kind of educational program. And it really is educational when you listen to how someone got their business started or how they made the next steps to grow and that kind of stuff. They felt like it was a good option to treat it as professional education and a way to kind of give to the business community and support us as well.
And one of your last interviews was with Kent, and
it was
probably one of the better podcasts in regards to understanding the village of Marble Cliff.
Right.
He's such a great speaker. He
is.
dove into it and understanding this very, 2 square mile, if that, I forget how many square mile it is, but government is government, and it's just a smaller version of it. But it's the same mechanisms, the same politics, quote unquote, that going on, but just on a smaller scale, on a microcosm comparatively, but still important to those that are living in that little community.
Right. And they're very lucky they have somebody who's forward thinking and is, again, I think like the chamber taking a chance on doing something a little differently. And, we're very lucky that he sits on the board and has, a great voice to lend on behalf of the village.
Right. So we tried to come up with the most convenient publishing schedule, and we varied that.
Right.
I know initially we went with, because of scheduling issues and problems and fitting in your schedule, obviously, to sit down and talk with folks and give yourself some time for research. We were on a once a month publishing schedule, and it worked really well.
Yes.
I think, and then we started to crank it up to every 3 weeks, and I think we saw some momentum come from that as well too. That it kind of started to take off a little bit more as well. We could get more people in over a year's time as well too. How did that change in regards to how you set yourself up in your scheduling too? That one extra week or one fewer weeks to prepare. Did that take some mental strain, or how did that change your life?
Not tremendously, because I think it was something that I so enjoyed. It was just one of my favorite parts. I mean, truly getting to take a deep dive into one business was so enjoyable for me. So doing the research, I had basically the same list of questions, and then every single time. And that would always be my fallbacks. And then depending on who we were talking to and how well I knew them, or if there had been something in the news recently that I wanted to make sure I touched on, I customized that each time. But it was more exciting, quite honestly, to increase it and get to talk to more people and beef that up a little bit.
All right. And I know, Stephanie, you can answer this as well, too, because of being on board as long as you were and sawing the social media strategy and the email strategy. Let's talk a little bit about that, how that's evolved as well, too, from your standpoint and moving forward. The podcast is included in every newsletter that goes out for the chamber, which is a weekly. What other pieces are being implemented that are being done, were being done, and as well as looking to the future?
So it goes into our weekly newsletter with a link, and so it's on our website. So it always sits there, and the link sends you to the website, and then Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I'm trying to think of all the social media.
Sure.
Yeah. So admittedly, we are kind of in a transition there with the social media. We had contracted out some work, and the person that was doing that work for us recently moved to Seattle. And in theory, he could do it from there, but it's more practical to have it here closer to home. So we're kind of in transition, getting our head around how to do that social media and how best to approach that. But the podcast link is included in all of that, and we're trying to stay active on that and keep up to date and find a new rhythm with our social media.
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of a double whammy with the transition of hosts. Also losing the social media person, or a choice to keep the social media in house.
Right.
Let's put it that
way.
Right.
That's kind of the goal at this point is to keep it in house and just I guess have a more intimate knowledge of it. I guess. I don't know if that's really the right way to phrase that, but we could do things a little more quickly.
Certainly
in-house.
Immediate.
Yeah, it's more immediate.
When that person's desk is 5 feet away.
Right. Instead of sending a picture to somebody,
yeah.
and so it does make it more immediate. we just have to get up to speed with it.
Sure. Well, and you can look at it as good timing or bad timing. It's probably very good timing because you get to own it, the change of it, and evolve with it as well. Because I know with the transition, we're looking at probably backing up publishing dates back to a month, probably because, again, new role for you.
Yeah, just a little this big microphone.
Right, of looking at, okay, I still want to continue, well, quote unquote, I still want to continue on with the podcast, but how to incorporate it into my day as the newly appointed executive director for the chamber. But it's just a week, so not big. But I think the implementation of a new person with social media, keeping it in-house, may be an easier transition as well, too.
Right. I think we're still very much in a transition phase. I just officially took this role as executive director in October. So I'm still in my learning curve. And then add to that the change in the social media contractor that we were using, and bringing someone in-house, and me changing roles altogether. There's a lot to learn.
Yeah.
I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. I sat next to Michelle, in the office, and
osmosis works pretty well.
Yeah,
too.
and I knew a lot about the chamber activities, but not so much the things that she did. And now I have literally switched chairs. I took your chair.
It's a great chair.
Yeah, it's a great chair. Yeah. There's a lot to learn, and it's a busy day, and I make my to-do list at the end of the day for my next day, and inevitably I get to work. Sometimes I check my email before I get in, and my whole day changes.
Welcome to life.
Yeah,
right,
exactly. Yeah, so it's never quite like I planned, and just kind of keeping up with things it still has me in a transition.
That's a great segue into talking about the transition of hosts.
Yeah.
So obviously you knew you were going to leave, and whether that was being discussed or not, one way or the other in the mind, you knew, okay, I'm moving on, but there are things I have to take care of.
Right.
What was the discussion like with Stephanie when you said, hey, I'm out of here? Totally up to you if you want to keep the podcast going, but let's talk about the podcast.
Right.
What was that conversation like?
Well, I told Steph that it was one of my favorite parts of the job. It had grown into that, and that I would, I just told her the truth. I think that I was very nervous, and that if we kept it going, which I thought we should, that we approach it the same way, and that don't put a ton of pressure on yourself, because the conversation really does take over. And so we scheduled a couple of podcasts, my last two, and did those in the office in a more comfortable setting. And Stephanie sat in on those, and got to see that I wasn't exaggerating. It really is very laid back and conversational, and the flow should be fairly natural. And you have these questions that you can fall back on if conversation kind of halts for some reason, but that never really happened, and thankfully. And but they were good conversation starters. So the chamber's very lucky that Stephanie knocked on our door a couple of years ago and said, hey, I'm interested in coming here. And her background and personality, just lent itself beautifully for the transition. So, I knew she'd be great. And of course she is. So thanks.
So she said that in the conversation. What did you hear?
Oh my gosh. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Who can I get to
How
do
do you
that?
portray deer in the headlights over a microphone? Like, oh.
I think, from the start, I totally agree that it needs to continue. I think it's a really great thing for the chamber, for our members, and for the folks who are listening. So there's no doubt that we wanted to keep it going. The struggle for me is overcoming the anxiety of having this big microphone in front of me, and feeling like I don't know how to do this. So my first thoughts were, okay, well, we have to keep it going. We have to keep it going. Who can I ask to do it? Who can be the voice? And I went through all kinds of different ideas in my head, and I'm like, okay, the fact is it's most natural probably for me to do it. So take a few deep cleansing breaths and just do it. And your encouragement, Brett, and your encouragement, Michelle.
Oh, thank you.
I know.
Did you end up going back and listening to some older episodes to kind of really listen to them differently? on how it was done?
That's a good question. I guess I didn't go back to very far. I mean, I generally listen to them as they come.
Right.
But I did
you're
go
hear
back
it with a different ear when you have to host it now.
Yes, and I did. I did go back and listen to probably 3 or 4, not the entire podcast, but parts of 3 or 4 of them. You're right. I didn't even remember that I did that, but I did right before we recorded my first one, to go back and just kind of listen to the flow and how the conversation went. And that kind of, that helped. And I had Michelle's list of questions that I just had in front of me, and I did use them probably more than Michelle does or did at the time. But that does help provide the backup, like when you are afraid of stalling out, then you won't if you have that. And the other thing that you had said, Brett, is that it doesn't really matter how long it is. It can be 10 minutes. It can be a half an hour. It's just wherever the conversation just kind of naturally stops. So relieving that pressure of having to fill 20 minutes was helpful too. I think probably mostly it was in my head.
Sure.
Because you're right. It's pretty natural, but heart races at first and mouth gets dry and
even though
it's
not live, you do have this big microphone in front of you, and there's a sense of pressure when that's not something you do every day.
Yeah.
But
even today.
Right. But it's also a sense of relief if you can, get out of your head long enough to think, okay, we can fix this because it's not live, and it can come off sounding pretty smooth even if we stumble a little bit along the way.
I think that the biggest thing for me was just the commitment to knowing that it has to go forward. I'm not going to stop doing this, and got to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I hadn't thought about the transition you talked about in regards to bringing it back in the office, getting away from the professional studio. That probably maybe helped you with the transition as well, too. It's in your office now.
Probably, yeah.
Bring a couple microphones in. It's not the intimidation factor of a studio that you're not comfortable in. You had never been in that studio that we were recording in.
Right.
And we were taking the podcast on the road for a few episodes as well, too.
Right.
For convenience sake as well, that moving, what we thought was going to be a different direction, but didn't happen. But it was an experiment and just didn't happen. But back in your office makes a whole lot of sense. And it may be just as comfortable for your guests as well, too, because
a lot of them have been there before. Yeah, and they're nervous, too. I mean, the people that, that we've interviewed, they were nervous, definitely. Yeah. So having that comfort level of knowing where they're going, knowing how to get there, and that kind of thing, I do think kind of helps.
And for me, I had the benefit of recording promo spots for some of our past events at the studio. So I at least had a little bit of a level of familiarity with going into the studio and talking into a microphone. And, that's not the case for everybody. So I do think it's a nice familiar setting to do it in the chamber offices.
Right. So moving forward, any new thoughts, any new ideas that you want to implement over the next few months? Have you put thought to that? Or the different type of people we want to talk to?
Oh, with regard to the podcast, I think one of the things that we had tossed out, I mean, I really do love the kind of up close and personal and finding out, how a business came along. And, I'm a small business owner myself still.
There.
Yeah, I have. I've owned 2 businesses by myself, and then my husband and I currently own a business together. So I'm a small business owner too, and so I do appreciate hearing other people's stories, and I think that I learned from it. I think our listeners can learn from it, and everybody's tackled it a little differently. And one of the things that I think has been great about the ones that we've had so far is the variety of businesses that we've invited in for it. So I think for the listeners, if you look at the list, it's this huge variety, and I think that shows kind of the breadth of our membership. So for folks who aren't members or just out there listening, they can see the kind of businesses that we have, and then it really covers a whole range of businesses. So I think that the up close and personal kind of how did you get here way is great. We've also kind of tossed around, do we start doing more like I don't know, a specific topic in business, and how do we address that, and kind of come at that from different angles. I don't know, for right now, I kind of feel like if it's not broke, don't fix it. And if this is our niche, and this is what we're known for, then that's the track we should stay on. If we start to feel like we want to mix it up a little bit, I do think that there are some other avenues we could venture down.
Yeah, we talked about other opportunities as well too, of just expanding the role of the podcast,
right?
And gives you the opportunity as a new host to do that, as well as Michelle was always kicking around that idea. We were always kicking around those ideas, right. So it's always on the table.
Sure. Yeah.
But
I think it's really key to mention too, from the member perspective, besides learning about other members, is that it's a great marketing tool for them. So they walk away with this podcast. I mean, we walk away learning something, a little bit more about perhaps that member or that industry. But the member walks away with a marketing piece that they can put on their website, that they can pull snippets of. You're great about helping them with, pulling out key pieces that would be great for marketing. And, there's no charge to them for being a guest on our podcast. And, it's really a benefit to everybody involved.
Yeah, there's not an episode that I didn't learn something.
Oh, my gosh.
Or
yes,
heard something said going, that makes sense. Especially when you start to change what you're doing in your world.
Right.
And things hit you differently when you start to think about things differently.
Right.
Whether it's a new business venture or you're venturing with a new career or whatever,
right.
You just hear it differently. But I think every episode, all the guests have done a fantastic job of bringing just little nuggets.
A nugget, yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, there have been times that I've walked away thinking, or not thinking, but just having learned something that I just didn't expect. And so, there was a couple times when I was kind of gobsmacked, for lack of a better word. And in one of those, a piece of advice came out of it. I mean, one of my favorite things was to ask, what advice were you given, or what advice would you now give? And one of the podcasts, there was a piece of advice given to one of our interviewees that I loved, and I have now used in a practical way with my kids and in my life. So, I definitely learned a life lesson out of doing an interview that, gosh, that's not what I expected to get out of it, but it was great.
All right. So, advice to a business owner or another chamber outside of the Columbus area that would like to start a podcast. We don't want any more competition here. But, since the podcast is worldwide, we've got it covered here. Yeah. But I'll ask both of you, what advice would you give a business owner or a number chamber that may be considering podcasting as a marketing tool? What would you tell them to keep in mind?
Steph, jump in anytime. I think I would tell them to try to, come up with what's unique about them and capitalize on it with their podcast, with whatever their, the theme is or what it is that they want to accomplish, and find out or identify what's unique and use it. Also, try to get the supporters on board first. And, not necessarily ask permission, but now that there's somebody that's doing this and it's working, don't recreate the wheel, and definitely get people on board first and realize that there are resources out there to help you get started, and that it's really a phenomenal tool to engage your members.
Yeah, they might be able to get sponsorship up front. They can say, here's what we want to do and model it after this or that, and be able to get some sponsorship up front. Right. So I would say definitely think about that. And, one of the things that I think our podcast does is, alongside of the information that's shared from the interviewees, is it showcases the personality of the chamber. Just in the conversations that take place. I do think that the conversations, Michelle's done a really great job of being very natural and being able to bring out the personality, not only of the person being interviewed, but her personality shows too. And I think that that's what I mean. I always tell people who are thinking about joining our chamber, that the personality of our chamber, I really do feel like represents the communities that we represent. And it's a really warm, sincere group of people who want to see each other want to support each other and see each other be successful. And I feel like that comes through in the interviews, just the personalities. And I think that's a real nice benefit for our members and for the chamber as a whole.
Yeah, I would think, and I agree, and I always think this medium is not a fake it medium. It's raw.
Right.
It's raw. The emotions are there. You just can't fake it versus writing a blog or having a professional blogger write it for you.
Right.
That represents your company. This is it.
Right.
And I think the podcast brings that out of the chamber as well as the guests.
Right.
I've seen overall. Congratulations on your move, Michelle.
Thank you very much.
That was a kick in the gut when you told me you were leaving. A little bit.
I second that.
Because I knew I was going to miss working with you. I knew the podcast would live on because it had legs, and I knew Stephanie was more than capable of getting this done. But working with you, I knew I was going to miss because it was a lot of fun. But I am looking forward to what Stephanie's going to do as well too, because the focus of this podcast, I think, is extremely important to me, as well as getting it done for the chamber as well too. So congratulations on your move to Experience Columbus, and congratulations on your new chair.
Thanks, Brett.
And new role.
Literally a new chair.
Yeah, exactly.
Literally a new chair. It moves.
Exactly. And I do look forward to working as we continue on with Business Inspires.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brett.
I look forward
Thank
to
you for
working with you too.
all your support. This is because of you and your great idea, and that our members are benefiting. So thank you for doing that.